Next year, the Jets could look a little bit different, and while it's way too early to even begin to talk about lines, we're still going to do it anyways. We'll talk about what the Jets might look like on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, Jets fans, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you enjoy what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, like I said, I want to talk about maybe some potential Jets forward arrangements. Obviously, there's a lot that's happening, this offseason for Winnipeg. Chief among them is a new coach. That remains a bit of a question mark. We've heard some interesting suggestions, but not really anyone other than Scott Arniel that I feel is super likely. But TBD, right? We're going to have to talk a little bit more about that over the next few weeks and months as the hiring process and interview process will probably start to heat up. I think the Jets might honestly be best just holding off a little bit. I think a bunch of coaching changes are probably about to take place, and some of them may be useful for Winnipeg. Obviously, hiring people who get fired is not always the best way to do things, but some of these coaching candidates might still be a pretty big upgrade on what the Jets have had before, and perhaps even could facilitate growth of some of Winnipeg's star young youth. So, interesting thoughts, but like I said, tonight's episode, we're going to be dedicating it a little more towards talking about who might be on what pairings and lines. And eventually, at the end of the episode, I thought it might be fun to talk about kind of what I'm expecting for next season. Because for the Jets, there are a lot of moving parts, and I don't know if all of them are going to put them in a winning position. But before we dive into the meat of this tonight, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more, because right now new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Now, like I said, if we start off with the Jets forwards, this is going to be a really tough one because I have to make some assumptions about how this team is going to be. One assumption that I'm going to make, and I don't know if I actually like it, is that Sean Monahan gets extended. I think the Jets are going to look at their center depth and not feel very comfortable having no real clear 2C. I feel like, for me, I would have been okay with having Lowry essentially be the 2C, with Lambert basically eating third-line minutes. I'd play Lambert with really highly skilled players, but you might be able to shelter him and maybe cut back his shifts a bit while Lowry sort of eats up the rest. I think you could have gotten away with that, and I think with how the Jets have already used their second-line combinations in the past, it's workable. Lambert looked like he was up to speed, at least at the NHL level in his NHL debut game, and sure, it's just one game in a end-of-season contest that perhaps didn't have crazy big implications, but I think for the Jets, you got a sense that Lambert's probably ready to step into the lineup next year, and that makes a lot of things very complicated because then you have to decide who you want to extend. But assuming Monahan does come back, which again, I can't say that I love, let's say the Jets' first line might be Connor-Scheifele and Velarde. I would expect that some version of that's going to be a thing. I wouldn't mind trying Connor-Scheifele and Perfetti. I don't know if Perfetti is going to be able to mask all of the issues with Scheifele and Connor together, but I guess if you have to have that duo, it's probably a little more preferable. Also, my assumption is that Ehlers is gone this offseason. I really do think that is kind of pushing towards that direction, but hey, maybe something really surprising happens. But Connor-Scheifele and Perfetti, I mean, it's not really how I would do it, but I could see it being a thing, especially if Mark continues to push for him to play with Kyle. Second line, you could have something like, Monahan, Nemesnikov, and I don't know who else at this point. Without Ehlers, you suddenly find yourself with a really big hole at wing. And I know people will say, well, why don't you just put Lambert up there? Lambert's best when he's at center, and I think that's where you really want to develop him. So I got to be honest, I'm struggling with the winger side of things because the Jets probably need to make a trade or two if Ehlers does go. Assuming Ehlers stays and Monahan comes back, I guess you could have like Ehlers, Monahan, and like Nemestikov or something. And people will say, well, Nemestikov's not really a second liner, but he was literally a second liner earlier this season, and he did a pretty decent job at it. Was he the best? No. But was he pretty decent for what you asked of him? Yeah. He scored at a pretty comparable rate to Monahan and actually kept up and offered some decent defensive support. So it's not the worst outcome. It's also not really what I would want to do. But given the options and what's available, maybe not the worst. Third line, Niederreiter, Lowry, and I would like to see Chibrikov get a chance here. I think Chibri might actually work really well with those two. He's an aggressive forechecker. He's got an endless motor, and he will keep rolling around the offensive zone continually until his legs give out. So I think that trio, if you're looking for a little more scoring punch than what Appleton brings, Chibrikov might be the guy you're looking for. That goal that he scored in his debut was a beaut. It was a perfect, well-placed shot, and it came off of an aggressive forecheck where he forced a turnover. So that, I think, is exactly the kind of play that the Jets need down low, especially if they want to boost their goal-scoring output from some of their bottom six. Fourth line, I guess you could roll something like Barron, Lambert, and Gustafsson. Lambert, I don't quite know how that's going to work. I think Barron's a decent fit because he's actually very skilled. Gustafsson, as much as I enjoy watching him, I still think that there's something in his game that's been missing at times. There were flashes during the postseason where he started to look more and more confident and more like the player that I want him to be, but I'm still not quite there with him yet. So it's hard to say, right? Now you'll probably notice I'm missing a few names here. I think one of Iafallo or Appleton is gone. I would expect it to be Iafallo. I think Iafallo probably doesn't stick around just because he's got a $4 million cap hit, and I could see him being vacated for somebody else. Velarde, I think, will somehow sit in the top six, either on the first or second line, so you can solve at least one of those big winger questions. But again, it's hard to get a sense of like how the Jets are going to want to run that because honestly, with how Winnipeg's depth structure is, they're lacking a little bit if Ehlers does leave. But Appleton and Iafallo don't really fix that. So one of them probably gets cut. Iafallo might have decent trade value. Maybe Appleton does. I don't know. I'm not really in that position to make a really strong assessment either way. But in terms of salary, that's like $6 million in cap hits. So maybe, one or both of them gets moved. And also you just need to open up roster spaces. I mean, you've got kids that could probably do a similar job, not a great one, but like Axel Janssen-Fjällby on your fourth line for the regular season is totally fine. I think he's actually been pretty decent. And, if you're talking about a player who's kind of like an Avs sort of player that's very fast and direct, AJF kind of does that. He's a very Miles Wood type, and maybe he would be a useful player for the Jets in their bottom six. So I just think if you're trying to cut costs and starting to reorganize the way that this team plays, you probably need to reduce the amount of pure forechecking talent that you have and focus more on guys who can bring a little bit more of an extra dimension to their game. Iafallo and Appleton unfortunately haven't. Iafallo I was a little disappointed by. I really thought he'd be better. Just seems so that something in his game didn't quite translate to being a really effective middle six forward. He was mostly a fourth liner, and again, with the cap hit that you're dealing with, probably not what you want to see. So the Jets definitely have some big questions there up front, and where some of these guys play is really going to depend on what happens with Monahan. My personal desire is probably to let both Toffoli and Monahan go. I like both of them a lot. I just don't think that they're fits for this team long term. But I bet you the front office is going to disagree on at least one of them. So we will keep an eye out for that. But obviously, on the defense, that's an even bigger question because the Jets, frankly, need to overhaul it, but they don't have a lot of room to do so without shaking things up pretty significantly and probably paying to have some cap hits removed from that back end. But we'll talk about that in just a moment. Before we go any further, though, I did want to let you know about Indeed and why, if you're somebody looking to hire, I would really recommend Indeed's wonderful service. There's no I in team, but there is one in Indeed, and that's the hiring platform you need to build your team. When you're hiring, you need Indeed. Indeed is the hiring platform where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. Instead of spending hours on multiple job sites searching for candidates with the right skills, Indeed's a powerful hiring platform that can help you do it all. With Instant Match, over 80% of employers get quality candidates whose resume on Indeed matches their job description the moment they sponsor a job, according to Indeed's US data. As somebody who has actually used Indeed when I was looking for work, I can personally attest to it being very useful. It's very detailed. They make the matching service very quick, and you'll also have salary requirements, your skill matches, and it'll give you an approximation of what really fits your job and resume archetype. So again, it's great, right? And with over 3 million businesses worldwide that already use it, you should become one of them that uses it too. Start hiring now with a $75 sponsored job credit to upgrade your job post at Indeed.com/lockedon. Offer good for a limited time. Again, claim your $75 credit now at Indeed.com/lockedon. That's Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Hey, friends, and welcome back to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are talking about some fun Jets stuff. Obviously, Winnipeg has, a long offseason ahead of it, and, we're not even a few weeks into Winnipeg, just getting eliminated. So the wounds are still fresh, the salt's still there, and I think we're all reeling from some of the announcements and the harsh realities that do kind of face the Jets going forward. But with all of this uncertainty and upheaval does lead to a lot of opportunity. The Jets have some legit chances to really reshape the way that this team is built, and I think that's actually exciting in a lot of ways, especially if they find the right person to lead it. Now, I talked about the forwards and what I could envision some potential line combos looking like. I now want to talk about the defense, because the defense, frankly, it's going to need some help, and it probably needs to let a few players go, even if I don't think the Jets are interested in doing that. We'll talk about that in just a moment, but I thought I would let you know something really cool the Locked On Network is doing. If you're a Fox Sports or ESPN watcher, maybe you find you have to turn down the volume because they're always shouting at you. Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, like I said, the Jets defense, it's going to be an interesting one. Winnipeg obviously has a priority to re-sign Dillon DeMello. I think that is one of the guys that I would really say has to be brought back. Look, I know that he's on the slower side and he's on the older side, but in terms of being right-sided and still competent enough to be a capable two-way defender who can probably get top 4 minutes, even if you don't want top pairing minutes, he's probably one of your best options. I think that he has a very good, rapport with the team. He plays well. And look, again, he's not as fast as he used to be. He is declining. But if you want to sign him for like a 3-year deal, I think that's a really ideal term length to keep him around. It allows him to settle a bit. And for the Jets, they have a guy who they can trust to play with Morrissey. I know that, against other top players like McDavid or McKinnon, maybe that lack of speed will start to get noticeable late in the playoffs and stuff. But if you can kind of measure out his minutes a little bit more, I think that there's a real value added to having him back. Look, I know DeMello, again, he's not the sexiest player. He doesn't always have the fanciest plays, but in terms of guys who are very defensively intelligent on this team, he probably is one of the few that I would say is worth bringing back. Brendan Dillon is a harder case because on the one hand, he is defensively dominant, great player. He's been a great leader, had a, all-time career season by his standards for offensive production, and was just really good. I thought that he played excellently. He played much better than I thought he would after the first initial showings with the Jets. And I think this year under Bones, he really flourished, but he's going to need a big contract extension. It probably starts with a 5. And I think at this stage of his career, with, him being on the wrong side of 30 and, probably only going to get, go downhill from here, I don't know if I want to tie up a lot of money on that left side. The Jets have Sandberg, who I think is ready to take on more responsibility. And as much as I really like Dillon and would love to have him back, I just feel like the Jets need to go in a little bit of a different direction. You have to open up spots on that left side because it's very jammed up. And, you're already sitting Heinola for long stretches or keeping him with the Moose. And so you got to bring him in because Villy is probably one of our most skilled puck-moving prospects. And, obviously, he may not have the ceiling that he once did of like an elite top pairing guy, but you know what? He's still got a lot of skill to burn. Maybe he was always destined to be a number 2 or a number 3D, maybe even a number 4, which is still very good. But he's never really gotten the chance to have it. And when he finally did, he broke his ankle. So this time, all things being equal, I'm just hoping that this is his chance to really blossom. But to do that, you are going to have to open up some spots on this team. And that's where I think Brendan Dillon's probably one of the few guys that's on the outs. Again, I love him, but I just feel like with the Jets not really having a lot of flexibility with the roster, he probably should be released. Now, Neil Pionk is a tough one because I think you really do need to trade him at some point, but I don't think the Jets really want to. I think they like him. I think they enjoy his presence, and I think that they, look at his locker room stuff and really feel that he's an asset to the team, which is true. In that case, and in that respect, I do believe that's the case. But in terms of the on-ice stuff, it's been anything but, and I think that's where I continue to really struggle to want to see him in the lineup, but I think it's just something we're going to have to accept. I've got to be honest, I don't really see this team moving on from him. And I think, given how much they have raved about his play, about his character and everything, I just really don't see them moving on. I think it would make sense if they did, but I know that they won't. Nate Schmidt, though, I do think the team's probably going to jettison him. I think that they'll probably pay some team to take his cap hit, which is kind of unfortunate because I actually think that between him and Pionk, I'd much rather keep Schmidt around. I know that his cap hit's a little eye-watering, but in terms of the actual on-ice product, between the two, it's not really close. Schmidt's relatively reliable and pretty decent. Pionk is anything but. He's unpredictable, he's chaotic, and I think against the Avs, you really saw that the decision-making and lack of speed unfortunately put him in really terrible positions to the point where he even scored an own goal. So it's just tough, right? You feel for him because, like I've said in previous episodes, no one really feels worse about it than he does. But unfortunately, the reality is this is an outcome-based business, and I think that is where he has really struggled. Logan Stanley, yeah, I think it's probably time for that experiment to end. He apparently requested a trade at some point earlier. I think it's time for him to find greener pastures with a team that can make use of him because it really shouldn't be the Jets. Winnipeg has, other depth defenders that can probably do about the same level of work. And honestly, if they brought back Colin Miller, I think you would do a much better job replacing Stanley with Miller, who could definitely provide an extra layer of puck moving ability on the back end. Honestly, Miller might even be decent enough to start for the Jets, but apparently they didn't really feel that way the first time around, so I can't imagine that they would do it again. But, if you're going to have to arrange these pairings, unless they make a big change or a big trade for a top 4D, you're basically looking at Morrissey, DeMello, Sandberg, or Dillon and Pionk, and one of like Sandberg and Schmidt, or Heinola and Schmidt, or Heinola, Sandberg, Heinola. Again, it's kind of dependent on what happens with Brendan Dillon and Nate Schmidt. I think both of those guys are likely to be on the way out, but hey, maybe the Jets surprise us and they keep both. I doubt it because you'd have to move at least Pionk's salary to make Brendan fit, unless Brendan takes a big pay cut, but he has no incentive to do that, and I don't think he would anyways. It doesn't really make sense. He's got to maximize his earnings potential, especially on the last contract of his career, like the last big one at least. So a lot to think about there. The Jets have any number of routes and directions that they can go, and all of them are exciting, and all of them also come with a lot of scary drawbacks if things go really south. But kind of on that wavelength of thinking, I thought about what next season might look like, and honestly, it's a huge question mark. But I'm going to try and puzzle our way through at least some early preseason thoughts and what could happen with this team that has a lot of directions it could go, but perhaps will end up playing it safe like they always do. We'll talk about that in just a quick moment. But before we go any further, I do want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel's giving you a shot to bring home a big victory of your own. this is the time for a lot of you who are watching the playoffs to really cast your bets and try and make the most of it. Obviously, you can't bet on Winnipeg unless you're looking at futures, but hey, maybe you think the Avs will eventually win the Cup. Maybe you're looking out east and think the Rangers might finally be able to do it after so many years of toiling around in either wild card or just top Metro seeds that haven't actually led to anything. But regardless of who you're rooting for, right now new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 in extra bonus money that you can use on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. To get started, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are just wrapping up with some thoughts. Way too early to really call it, but let's be honest, right? We don't have a lot of fun things to talk about right now when it comes to the Jets. You have to think more in the long term because the immediate future is very up in the air. There's a lot of uncertainty. I think a lot of us are still trying to figure out what exactly this team is going to be in the coming seasons. And it kind of starts with the coaching staff change that will really dictate the direction the Jets go in. I think regardless of what happens, though, I kind of get the sense that the Jets are not going to be great next season. I think Winnipeg is going to be a fun team, but I think they're going to take a step back. I think the change from being a really defensively oriented team to maybe a squad that starts to be more offensively aggressive and applies pressure, I think that could have some initial growing pains, especially if you start incorporating more youth, right? Salamonson might not be ready this season or next season to take that next step, but maybe towards the end of the year, he starts getting minutes. Lambert's probably ready for a full-time spot. Shiberkov looks like he might be ready. Heinola will probably slide in. So you have a lot of young talent that's going to be very different than how the Jets usually play. I think Winnipeg is going to have to adjust to a new style of hockey that maybe they're not used to. And with that, kind of comes with some discomfort. I think it's going to be a rough first few months even. And, maybe the Jets don't do well. They might even struggle to make the playoffs. They might even be a wild card team. Now, because you have Hellebuck, I think that might be obviously, one of the big balancing factors here. And perhaps that's what carries them into the postseason. But I think for this upcoming year, I'm expecting a rough year from the Jets. Not because they're not going to be talented. I think they are. But I think that there's going to be a bit of a learning curve. And I think a lot of players are going to have to get comfortable with playing outside of their comfort zone. And that's where, the Jets may have real room for growth. If we see different changes to Scheifele's game, maybe to how Connor approaches things, some of the other established veterans, if they start to make adjustments, maybe this team looks a little bit better by the time the trade deadline rolls around. But I think it's going to take time. And depending on which coach the Jets select, how Winnipeg will set up and play, especially when they're in the lead or chasing a game, can really dictate, what sort of identity this squad is going to form. And I think that's, again, a huge question. But given how good the Avs are and the Stars are and the sudden resurgence of the Preds in the Central, I really do feel like the Jets might take a bit of a step back. I hate to say it, but I get the sense that Winnipeg is going to be fighting for a wild card. And I don't mean that because this team is bad. I just think that the margin for error is going to be a lot smaller. And if you're the Jets and you're likely to lose a couple of really big players and replace them with youth products, well, you should probably expect that the kids are going to have their own growing pains at the start of the season, maybe even all the way through the whole year. But you still got to let them play, and you still have to give them those minutes because they've got to get acclimated to this level of hockey and get up to game speed. So it's just something you have to live with. I think it's going to be tough. I know somebody on Twitter was mad at me because they were like, well, why would the Jets, not focus on the playoffs? And for me, I look at next year as a development year. It's an evaluation period, right? If you want to know what the coach is like, you have to give them the full season. And unless they're really, really not working out and it's very obvious that they have no idea what they're doing, fine, make a change. But I think if, the option is like, say, Todd Nelson or Scott O'Neill or David Carl, maybe even Jay Woodcroft, all of these guys who could potentially come to the Jets I think you've got to give them a season to work it out and figure out what they actually have with this roster, because the team has lots of good building blocks already in place. It's just figuring out the best way to arrange and deploy them. One guy who might be of interest to the Jets, there's actually two of them. One of them who is currently available, and the second one who might be available shortly. It's Sheldon Keefe and Rod Brind'Amour. And I have some reservations about both. With Keefe, I kind of wonder how much of his recent stylistic changes, trying to be more defensively responsible and playing the grittier players, was his choice, or how much of it was coming from up top. With Brind'Amour, Rod is a really good coach, and I think in terms of offensive pressure and aggressiveness, he definitely gets it. But his teams have always struggled to have really good finishing talent, at least when it comes to Carolina, and I don't know if he's necessarily pushing away from that, or if it's just ownership or the front office trying to extract value out of whatever they can from players who maybe don't light up the lamp all that much, but create lots of chances. I don't know. Either way, I think both coaches are good at what they do. I don't know if I want them at this point. I think the Jets might be better off going with a younger coach who can really grow with the team. Todd Nelson, I think, remains one of my top candidates. He's really been bossing it at almost every level that he's coached. He is a Calder Cup champion, and with the Bears and the way that they've played, they have absolutely lit the AHL up. And I think he might be a very intriguing candidate if Winnipeg was interested in making that play. But it does kind of sound like Scott Arniel remains most likely the favorite to succeed Bones, which, like I said, I'm not going to be angry or upset about it, but I feel like when you have this much of an open door to all these other coaches and possibilities, you'd be really silly not to walk through and see what's out there. I know that comfort can be a good thing, and sometimes having an experienced coach who's worked on your team and knows the players and systems well can be a benefit if they end up taking over. But I think, the Jets need a fresh perspective. They need somebody from outside the org who can look at things from, a fresh set of eyes, evaluate some of the problems with the way that the Jets play, and come up with some real long-term solutions. I don't know that Arniel is not the guy to do this. Maybe he is. Maybe he's actually really great and we're not giving him enough credit. But I don't yet have enough of a sample size of him in any sort of role that would get close to this to where I could say, confidently either way. Some of what he did when he was managing in Rick's absence was nice. Some of it was not so nice. And I don't know how much was him, how much was just the Jets being mediocre, and how much was, some of Rick's instructions needing to be adhered to. So a lot of uncertainty, a lot of excitement. I think this offseason promises to be one of the most explosive in Winnipeg Jets history, but we're not going to have any answers all that soon, as I'm sure the interview process for the coaching staff is going to take some time. But hopefully when they do make that change, they also switch out the special teams coordinators, because I think that is a huge sore spot and likely something that a new coach will already want to fix when he joins. But we are probably still at least a few months away from all of this starting to really take shape. I would hope that the Jets have, their phones working 24/7 looking for a good candidate. They really need to get those interviews underway pretty soon. So keep an eye out as we start to hear more candidates being linked to the Jets. We'll talk about some of them, and if they have any in particular that are really good quality candidates, we can try and look at maybe some old game tape and see what worked for them and maybe what didn't. But for tonight's episode, that is going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll be back here tomorrow with even more offseason and playoff coverage, so don't go anywhere. And as always, have a great night and go Jets go.